Vì Dukkha Thissa cháuပြောလာတာတစ်စိတ်တစ်ပိုင်းနမူနာလေးသိအောင်ညကွက်ပြီးတော့ပြောခဲ့ပါတယ်မမကထိုင်ချတဲ့အခါမှာထိုင်နေတဲ့စိတ်အစဉ်စဉ်နာဒုက္ခသစ္စာနဲ့ထိုင်တဲ့ရုပ်အစဉ်စဉ်ရုပ်ဒုက္ခသစ္စာထိုင်တဲ့ကာလမှာထင်ရှားတာပေါ့လေသူတို့ဖြစ်စေမှာမရှိလို့ရှိရင်ကိလေသာဖြစ်နိုင်ပုံလေးတွေပြောတော့ပါတယ်ဒါတော့သူတို့ဖြစ်စေဘာဖြစ်လို့ရှုရတယ်လဲဆိုတာပေါ့လေဒါအတိပ္ပယ်အလိုလိုနားလည်တော့ပါတယ်မရှိလျင်ကိလေသာတွေဖြစ်နိုင်တယ်ဆိုတော့သတိပဋ္ဌာန်နည်းနဲ့မရှိမှလို့ရှိရင်ကိလေသာတွေဖြစ်နိုင်တယ်ဆိုတော့သတိပဋ္ဌာန်နည်းနဲ့ရှုမှလို့ရှိရင်တော့ကိလေသာမဖြစ်နိုင်ဘူးဆိုတဲ့အဓိပ္ပာယ်ရပါတယ်ကွာအဲ့ဒါဒီနေ့စာရွေးနဲ့လက်တွေ့တစ်ခုပေါင်းစပ်ပြီးတော့ဖြည့်ရှင်းပါဦးမယ်ပြီးတော့ထိုင်စေကာလမှာဖြစ်တဲ့ဒုက္ခသစ္စာနမူနာလေးသိုံညပြောတော့မှာကတော့ဒုက္ခသစ္စာဆိုတာဓဝါ6ပါးကအာယု6ပါးထင်ဟလာရင်အတိစိတ်6ပါးဒါတွေကိုဒုက္ခသစ္စာလို့ဆိုရပုံပေါ့လေအဲ့ဒါတွေလည်းလွယ်လွယ်သိအောင်လို့ပြောပါမယ်ဒီနည်းအားဖြင့်ခန္ဓာအတိုက်တအပွင့်တဒီတရားတွေဟာထင်ရှားနေပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီတတိမှလည်းများအကုန်လုံးဒုက္ခသစ္စာဖြစ်ပုံအဲ့ဒါလေးရှင်းနေတင်ပြပါမယ်
The Venerable Sayadaw has talked on one aspect of the Noble Truth, namely knowing one part of it during the process of sitting down. From the standing, changing from the standing posture into the sitting posture. And in this we have a series of mental intentions to sit down, and these represent the noble truth of suffering with regard to mentality. In this we also have a series of material processes, of the process of sitting down, which represents the noble truth of suffering with regard to materiality. Now, all of these are distinct phenomena, and the Venerable Sayadaw has explained how, or if one does not observe the presently arising object or process, then the mental defilements will arise. And why does one has to explain this? Well, it's quite obvious. Namely, in the absence of mindfulness, of observation, the mental defilements will arise. In the presence of mindfulness, with satipatthana, one will be free from the mental defilements, the kilesas. This will be explained today, both from a theoretical as well as from a practical point of view. Now, as we have seen, the noble truth of suffering can be experienced during the process of sitting down. The noble truth of suffering can also be experienced with regard to all phenomena arising at the 6 sense doors. And to put it in different words, different terms, we can also speak of the striker element, the receptor element, and the ignition element, and the noble truth of suffering applies to all three of them. And this will be explained today.
Vipassana niyama tukku shiပါတယ်။ niyamaဆိုတာကမလွှဲမသွေပေါ့လေ။အစဉ်အလာမလွှဲမသွေရှောင်တိန်လို့ရတာအစဉ်အလာတည့်ရပေါ့လေတော့ကိန်းတီတတ်မှတ်ချက်လို့ခေါ်ပါတယ်။အဲဒါပါဠိလိုနိယမလို့ခေါ်ပါတယ်။နိယမဆိုတာကကိုယ်ရဲ့ဒုက္ခသစ္စာထိုက်တဲ့တရားတွေသူတို့ဖြစ်စေမှာကိုယ်တို့သတိပဋ္ဌာန်နည်းနဲ့မရှုဘူးဆိုရင်စိတ်ကအထိန်ချုပ်လွတ်သွားတော့အာယုံမှာမကတ်တော့အာယုံမှာမကတ်တော့ဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်အဲ့ဒီအာယုံကိုလည်းပဲမသိတော့မသိရုံနဲ့မဟုတ်ဘူးအတိလည်းမှားသွားတာမသိမှုဒီမှာခုဖြစ်တော့တယ်အမှန်မသိလို့အလွဲတွေသိတော့တာတိမ်တလာဖုံးနေတဲ့မျက်စိဟာမြင်ခွင့်ကိုအရှင်းမမြင်တာလည်းရှိပါတယ်မြင်လည်းပဲအမှန်မမြင်ဘူးအဲဒီသဘောမျိုးပါအမှန်မမြင်ဘူးအလွဲမြင်တယ်အမှန်မသိဘူးအလွဲသိတယ်အဲ့တော့မသိမှုဒီမှာခုအမှန်မသိမှုဒီမှာခုအဲ့ဒါအဝိဇ္ဇာခေါ်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါဝင်သွားတာပါကြည့်ရမသိလို့ရှိရင်တွေ့မိတော့တာပဲတာယာတတ်မဲ့မိတော့တာပဲအဲ့ဒါလောဘခေါ်တယ်တဏှာလည်းခေါ်ရတယ်တော့ဒီပဲတဖြစ်တတ်တာပါပဲတော့အဲ့ဒါလို့ညီညာမှုဖြစ်မဲ့အခြေအနေကိုဖြစ်နေတာကိုဖြစ်တော်မှာကိုပေါ့လေမယုံရှားတဲ့သဘောပေါ့အဲ့ဒါလည်းဖြစ်တော့ပါတယ်မယုံရှားဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဒီဟာကိုမကြောက်တဲ့သဘောလည်းဖြစ်သွားတယ်ဒါတော့အာယုံမှာမကပ်ဘူးဆိုတာနဲ့ပဲဥဒိကြဆိုတာလည်းဖြစ်တော့ပါတယ်ဒီရဲ့မှာပူပန်မှုဆိုတာလည်းအကြောင်းအလဲဆိုတာဖြစ်လာနိုင်ပါတယ်ဒါတော့မက်ဆီယာလေးတွေ့လို့ရှိရင်မဲ့မှုတာယာတတ်မဲ့မှုဖြစ်တော့တာပါပဲတော့မျက်စိမုန်းစီယာထင်လိုက်လို့ရှိရင်လည်းပဲမျက်မှုမုန်းမှုဒေါသဖြစ်တော့တာပါပဲတော့လောဘကိုတော့ကာမိသနာနိဝရဏခေါ်ပါတယ်ဒေါသကိုတော့ဗျာပါဒနိဝရဏလို့ခေါ်ပါတယ်ဒီပြင်အခြားကိလေသာတွေလည်းပဲနှလုံးသွင်းအလိုက်ပေါ့လေဖြစ်ပေါ်လာတတ်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါကြီးကတော့မနာလိုမှုတို့ဝန်တိုမှုတို့ပြီးတော့ဂုဏ်ယူဝင်ကြွားမှုမာနတို့စသည်ပေါ့လေဒါကြီးအဲ့ဒါကြီးတော့မပြောတော့ပါဘူးခုနဟာကြီးတော့မှတ်ထားရင်လုံးတော့ပါတယ်
In the field of Satipatthana, there exists a certain law that certainly cannot be avoided, and such a thing that is certain, or is a certain law. This in the Pali language is known as niyama, and the law says that if one does not observe a presently arising object in the body or the mind, then one will be no longer the mind will no longer be under control. There won't be any limits, any limitations to it. And with this, one will no longer know, or one will know wrongly. Now, as an illustration, serves the cataract. A person who suffers from cataract and eye disease either does not see at all, or if he or she sees, then sees in a perverted manner, in a wrong manner. The same thing applies to knowing. So there's either not knowing at all or knowing wrongly. This is both of these together are known as ignorance avidya, and this ignorance does arise when one is not mindful of the presently arising objects. If one does not know the arising object, then surely one will crave for an object, one may get attached to an object. This is called, in the Pali language, either greed, lobha, or craving, tanha. And when such impurity arises, then there will be no disgust for it, no moral shame with regard to it, nor will one be afraid of this impurity. And furthermore, the mind will not be sticking to the object. And this fact of not sticking to the object is known as uddhacca. It's the mental state of restlessness. And on certain occasions, it may arise, or worries, kukucca may also arise. And when a person encounters some desirable, enticing object, then greed, lobha may or will arise. And when encountering an undesirable object, then ill will, dosa, arises. And another term for lobha, for greed, is is the hindrance of sense desire, or is sense desire, kama chanda, and another term for ill will is in the Pali language is vyapada. And furthermore, jealousy may arise, jealousy may arise, and stinginess may arise, and one may take pride in certain qualities. So pride may arise, and the Venerable Sayadaw is not going to mention all of these unwholesome mental states. The ones that he has mentioned should be enough.
Edi tiyasu ko Pali lo kili sa lo khaw ba. Sankili sa lo le di le khaw ba di. Sankili sa soda ka alon nitsit tat de thabo lo so ba. Long nyai tat de thabo lo di lo le ba so ba. Di do nitsit tat deတရားရှိအနှိမ့်ဆက်ခံလည်းရှိရပါဘူး။လောင်တတ်တဲ့သဘောရှိလို့ရှိရင်လောင်စာလည်းရှိရပါဘူး။အဲဒီအနှိမ့်ဆက်ခံလောင်စာတွေကဘာတွေတော့လို့ဆိုတော့နားလည်အောင်ပြောရလို့ရှိရင်တော့နာနဲ့ယုတ်တရားတွေပါပဲ။ဒီတရားတွေပဲအနှိမ့်ဆက်ခံရပါအလောင်းခံရတာပါပဲ။သူတို့ကအနှိမ့်ဆက်ခံတဲ့လောင်စာတ တရားတွေပေါ့ဆိုလိုတာကတော့သကိလေသာနှိစ္စတတ်တဲ့တရားတွေရှိနေလို့စိတ်ပင်မမှုတွေကိုယ်ပင်မမှုတွေဖြစ်ရတယ်ဆိုတဲ့သဘောပါပဲလောင်တတ်တဲ့တရားရှိနေလို့စိတ်တွေဟာပူလောင်ဆင်းရတယ်ရုပ်တွေဟာလည်းပူလောင်ဆင်းရတယ်လို့ဒီလိုဆိုလိုပါတယ်ဒီတော့နာနဲ့ရုပ်တရားတွေဟာတမျိုးပြောလိုက်လို့ရှိရင်ဘဝလို့ဆိုရမှာပါပဲဘဝဟာကိလေသာနှိစ္စခံရတော့ပြင်မနဲ့ကိလေသာမိလောင်လို့ပူလောင်တယ်မင်းညစ်တယ်ဆိုတာတော့ဒါလည်းဖြစ်သွားတာပါပဲ
There are Dhamma groups known in the Pali language either as kilesa or as samkilesa. Now, samkilesa is defined as having the nature of tormenting or having the nature of burning. And if this samkilesa has the nature of tormenting, the nature of burning, then there must also be some person who suffers this, or some being who suffers torment and burning. So what are these who endure the torment and the burning? Well, these are mentality and materiality, nama and rupa. And nama and rupa, mentality and materiality, have to endure the being tormented, being burned by the defilements. And because because they torment and burn, one, or the dhammas which torment and burn exist, one suffers. These, or mentality and materiality, nama and rupa, suffer. And mentality and materiality can be said to be life, or can be interpreted as life, or as one's existence. And so it's the existence, one's existence, which endures the torment and the burning through the defilements. And this happens.
Ahirika Notava Udija Di Limugaro Sik Pitain Lupani, Auto Sik Pitain Lupani, Janet Lovagaro Chisia Lady Timbola Lucy Chidelu Timala Lucy Ilita Timu Pola Jan Muzia Lutimala Lucy Muhu Dodar Capola Jan. Through say to Kurema, Pupa Widom of Chipa. Are you a live body? Chisia Muzia, I own like Chimu Momu Temalashi. Through the Kujina when I wrote about it. She, Piedore Ilitari ha. No, Piedare. ဖြစ်ပေါ်မဲ့ကိလေသာတွေရဲ့တရားအကြောင်းဖြစ်တာမဟုတ်လို့ရှေးကိလေသာတွေဟာကိုကိလေသာဝတ္ထုလို့ဒီလိုပဲတစ်မျိုးသုံးထားပါတယ်
These mental defilements, or these kilesas, they arise almost all the time in the mind when one does not develop satipatthana. And the four, namely delusion, moha, and then moral shamelessness and moral fearlessness of wrongdoing, and anotapa and restlessness, uddhacca, arise in every unwholesome consciousness. When encountering some desirable object, then lobha will arise, and based in delusion. And when encountering some undesirable object, then ill will or hatred will arise, dosa, together with moha and the others. And so they arise in all unwholesome, or in every unwholesome consciousness. And because they have arisen in the distant, in the past and distant past, they are known as kilesa vatu.
Now kilesa diya tu ami jubido. Now kilesa piyada. Now kilesa diya shi pitwale kilesa le solo.
And the mental defilements which will arise in the future are based on the mental defilements which have arisen in the past.
Sita Mari Lefida. You must have Tamu Kumis as a Kama. You must have Limu, Yandamu, Jingmon says who Nimid the Gari Lagaching of Yosu. Sita Mazraga to Rabisi by Silumu. Yatalu Shalumu. Kauna Bila Kaujumia Sura Bila Suimia Sura. Kudu Agudu through a Jew, Joshi Joe Madihu. Kauna Bila Kaujumia Sura Bila Suimia. The Piabi Bibi, so your body. The boy that Lekan Tare, a use of marble. That's a brain sayaga, a Mari body that is okay. I look at this way. Kilidari Picard, Suria, Siha, Biman Milu Laundades, or the Laundamiaha Milon Lucy, many to Lubori. The Toto Kilidari, a six will be Long Lucy, says here, many people, Nipa Chani.
When these mental defilements, the kilesas, are left uncontrolled, then they will lead to wrongful behavior by body, they will lead to wrongful behavior by speech, and also to wrongful behavior on a mental level. And what are the forms of wrongful physical behavior? Well, killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And the 4 forms of wrongful speech are false speech, and then backbiting or slandering, furthermore rough language, harsh language, and indulging in meaningless, useless talk. And wrongful mental behavior, wrongful attitude comprises covetousness, as well as the wanting to kill another, and not believing that wholesome deeds lead to wholesome results, not believing that unwholesome deeds will lead to unwholesome results, and not knowing what wholesomeness is and what unwholesomeness is, and also believing that with death and everything ends, annihilation takes place, and accepting these wrongful views for one's life. So, if these arise and one accepts them, or accepts these mental defilements, then indeed it is tiring for the mind, exhausting for the mind, and the mind gets burned just like a fire burns up its fuel. And if the mental defilements, the kilesas, burn the mind, then the mind gets stained, and cinders or ashes remain.
Through Niselu, Pimayuna Mahopo, Kilita Miga Longnelu, Pulong Mahopo, Longza Pite, Kone Seha, Many be a Chinese. Many Milong, many a Mividong, but you got Mamma too much a ye do it, along the machine a ye do it. Go so joke send a name over Daluva, Kilita along Kayalu. Many young hope had it. Along Kayale, Kone, Seha, Tomu Boaha body. Kilita send a nature over it, Outan Charlie over it. It's a lot so about the Kilita yet. Did through Shilo to Mansere Pulolo, Manu. Send that name as that Bruma di Pico Lula Jamam Hobo. You must say so Jama. Sorry, you must say so Vido. The town that are in Nijian. Few sent and Shimido Nijian. Send that me in Nijina Bogoya. Uramia Saga. Pulong Sing a job, Otanjaji, a jump hit the Kilida. Good look at it, Nini, Pepsi, Bevo body. Hoja target about it. Hoja, I genology, Jindon the law. Pimansia Muri, the CV, your Vatwana. Pulong Huri, your Viro. Long that the media, your Pulamuri Kines or Ijamuri Yame. Through she send a ninja, through your badology. Poa send a loose send a leve. Nitella 9 years, so a day beha. Tireva part of it.
not only do these mental defilements torment and exhaust or tire those who experience them, but they also burn the person. And the mind, after getting burned by the mental defilements, remains in a stained, in a dirty state, and therefore the mind loses in terms of standard. Its standard becomes low, and nobody, just like nobody wants the cinders, the leftover after a fire, so too nobody wants a mind or the corresponding existence that has been shaped by the mental defilements, that has been tormented by the mental defilements, with the cinders remaining and lowering the standard of this mind or existence. And as nobody wants, or because the mental defilements cause this loss in standard, everyone will feel disgusted or ashamed with this kind of a state. Now, those wanting to find some relief, who want to live in a pure and for those who want to want some relief, who want to live in a pure and happy manner, the Buddha has given the Satipatthana way. And if one practices according to this Satipatthana way, then gradually one will gain purity and peace of mind. And it goes without saying that also the mind will be uplifted, namely the fact that the kilesas lead to a lowering in standard. So when the kilesas are absent, then it means one's life gets uplifted.
သူကမကောင်းကျိုးတွေပဲမွေးထုတ်ပေးနေတာဒီကောင်းကျိုးတွေမှန်သမျှဟာအဲ့ဒီကိလေသာတွေကလာနေတာပဲလို့ဒီလိုဆိုလို့ရတဲ့မှာဒါသူဆောင်ရမယ့်ကိစ္စပဲဒီတော့စောစောကပြောခဲ့တဲ့အတိုင်းကိလေသာတွေဝင်လာတော့စိတ်ဟာမင်းညစ်ပြီးတော့သွားတာပဲနောက်ကျသွားတာသူတို့ဝင်ရောက်ပြီးတော့စိတ်ကိုမှုလိုက်တဲ့အတွက်နောက်ကျသွားတယ်နောက်ကျတတ်တဲ့တရားပဲနောက်ကျတတ်တဲ့တရားပဲဒီလိုလည်းပဲဉာဏ်နဲ့မှထင်လာတတ်တယ်စဉ်းစားကြည့်လိုက်လို့ရှိရင်လည်းဒီသဘောကြီးပေါ်တတ်ပါတယ်ပြီးတော့နှိမ့်ဆက်တတ်တဲ့တရားပူလုံစေတတ်တဲ့တရားပူလုံလောင်ငိမ့်တတ်တဲ့တရားပဲလို့ဒီလိုပဲထင်လာတတ်တယ်ဒါဒီလိုဖြစ်ရတာအရင်ဆက်လိုက်လို့ရှိရင်အရာရာမှာပေါ့လေစိတ်ကိုထိမ့်ချုပ်မှုမရှိဘဲနဲ့ဖြစ်ရှင်လို့ဖြစ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ပေါ့လေကောင်းတဲ့ဘက်ကိုဥတည်မှုမရှိလို့ဖြစ်ရတာဆိုတာဒီမှာသွားပြီးတော့ကောက်ချက်ကြပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါအောက်သူစိတ်ဖြစ်ခြင်းအနည်းဆုံးအကြောင်းပဲဒီမှာအာယုန်နိသမနစိကာရခေါ်တယ်ဖြစ်ရှင်လို့ဖြစ်လွတ်လပ်ခွင့်ပေးထားတဲ့သဘောမျိုးပေါ့လေဒီမှာဘာမှကောင်းတဲ့ဘက်ကဥတည်ချက်မရှိဘဲနဲ့စိတ်ကိုပြစ်ထားတာပေါ့လေမွေးထားတဲ့ကလေးလေးဘာမှလိမ်မောင်ပြုရမှမသိပဲနဲ့ထင်လို့နေတော့လို့ဆိုတာပေါ့လေပြစ်ထားတယ်ပေါ့လေထင်လို့နေတော့ဆိုတော့ကောင်းကျိုးတဲ့ကောင်းတာတဲ့မကောင်းတာတွေဖြစ်ဖို့ရည်တည်ကြနေတာပေါ့စိတ်လည်းပဲဒီတိုင်းပါပဲဒီတိုင်းပဲပြစ်ထားလိုက်တာလွတ်လပ်လပ်နေတော့ပြစ်ထားလိုက်တော့ဥတည်ချက်ကအမှန်တော့အလွဲကြီးအကုန်လုံးရှောက်ဖြစ်ကုန်မကောင်းကျိုးတွေအကုန်လုံးရှောက်ဖြစ်ကုန်တာ
Because the mental defilements torment, because they cause exhaustion, they are known as akusala. And a mind in which which is tormented and tires is also called as akusala. So, and these states then become the topic of the talk of others, and blame will ensue. Therefore, they are known as akusala. They and the characteristic of akusala of unwholesomeness is that it has faultiness as one characteristic, and furthermore it leads to bad results. And the Pali expression for it is savaja dukkha vipaka lakanam. And its function is opposition to wholesomeness. Kusala patipaka rasam in the Pali language. So the mind that is governed by akusala will want greed, lobha, instead of alobha, non-greed. So its function is simply to oppose wholesomeness, and as a result of this, it does not, as it opposes wholesomeness, it then does not bring about any benefits. So therefore, it is said as a second function that it produces harm or misfortune. It does not bring about any positive results. And this aspect is known as anatta janana rasa. And as long as the mental defilements arise in the mind, this akusala will produce harm or misfortune. And it is, as mentioned earlier on, the mind which is influenced by unwholesomeness will be polluted, will be impure, and especially obscured. And this state of obscurity is the manifestation of the mind. This is how one experiences unwholesomeness for oneself, in one's mind. And when this Dhamma, namely unwholesomeness, which torments and which burns, if this is not reined in, if it's not controlled, and one just lets the mind go free and with the thought of may happen whatever wants to happen, and there's no adverting of the mind, no turning of the mind, then it leads to much negative results. And an illustration for this is like giving birth to a child and then raising this child without setting any limits, without controlling this child. And as a result of this, the child will perform all sorts of mischievous things, or do mischievous things. So same thing goes for a mind which is left without control, which is not well directed. Such a mind will only end up producing unwholesome things. And therefore, unwise attention is the proximate cause of unwholesomeness.
Agusalaga a pici, Maconjoya, or a pikin, a bimere, Tanchine, Conjoya. That good to yet, Vavala Canal. The Lupiada ha to yet good to yet, looks on Jaga, Bibian Loga. The looks on your Bibian Saga. I would go to a Piacibit out to Gisa. Good as I would do Piacibit. Auto Gudu Piacina, Sanya Bedaloni. Gudu Segaro, Agudu Piacipina. Agusala, Widas and Arasago, the Ducasa Dave. And I'm a Piacina seeing the Lovado than Yamida. Piacina says her, Pucinta Shindy, Picani liver. Davolo, Tuya. Wotana, Pisupatana, so Savare. She sees that she not the Yalu Yanema Tina that day. Begin that she na I would go Piacina is one sheet, Kesa, Pucina Chiari, that if he had a Yesela Lucia, and he's a Chongaro. Yoni Samana Sigara cover. Seiko. Guluresi, Kaunesi, Yawn, Beck and Pira. Camone Cadra Sierra in the neck and Luvalino. Beck and Piru Cornu. I want to say the Charava Taimane Demia Pia, Niera, Seku Beck and Piru Luval. So look at the moment that she didn't see Sinive Pia Juda Me Suravoli in the Gurego. Seku, Kuluresi, Pepi Tower, Pecking Tower. Pecking Conley, Kudu Sipili.
wholesomeness, kusala, is not like unwholesomeness, akusala. And kusala has as characteristic that it is faultless, or that it is faultless, and it brings about happy results. It is clean, it is faultless, free of blame. And its function is to destroy unwholesomeness, akusala. And when it does not perform this function, and the function, as we have seen, of unwholesomeness is opposition to wholesomeness. So here, with regard to wholesomeness, the function is to destroy unwholesomeness, akusala. The Pali for this is akusala viddasana rasam. And as long as unwholesomeness does not get destroyed, unwholesomeness, or as long as this function does not get performed, then unwholesomeness will arise. And when wholesomeness performs its function of destroying unwholesomeness, then wholesomeness will arise. So its wholesomeness then manifests as purity, and this can be experienced in one's mind. And when we analyze the proximate cause for the arising of this purity, then we find that it is yoniso manasikara, which means wise attention, or the good, well-directed mind, or good directing of the mind, adverting of the mind. And just like one needs to direct the mind properly during driving, or the car during driving, so too one needs to direct or advert the mind properly in one's life. And if one resolves to always do good, then many good things will arise. And the more one directs or adverts the mind towards wholesomeness, the more wholesome things will arise.
ဒီတော့ဒီဝိထာနီးရှုမှတ်တဲ့နီးမသိဘူးဆိုရင်သိပေမဲ့လို့အဲ့ဒီနီးအသုံးချဘူးဆိုရင်အဲ့ဒီနီးကိုစနစ်တကျစိတ်စိတ်ဆက်ဆက်ယူတည်တည်နဲ့အသုံးမချဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ကိလေသာတွေကဝင်လာပဲစိတ်စဉ်ဝင်လာပဲအဲ့ဒီစိတ်စဉ်အဝင်ခါရတဲ့ကိလေသာတွေဟာကိလေသာတွေအဝင်ခါရတဲ့စိတ်ဟာအကုသိုလ်စိတ်ကြီးပဲဒါကြောင့်ဒီမှာနိယာမမရှုလျင်ကိလေသာဝင်တဲ့ကိလေသာတွေဝင်လာတာပဲရှုလျင်ကိလေစင်နဲ့ရှုလို့ရှိရင်ခုနညီညွတ်မှုတွေဖြစ်ခွင့်မရဘဲနဲ့စင်ကြယ်တန်ရှင်းနေတယ်အဲ့ဒီစင်ကြယ်တန်ရှင်းတဲ့စိတ်စဉ်ဟာကုသိုလ်စိတ်အစဉ်ပဲအကုသိုလ်စိတ်စဉ်ကမကောင်းကျိုးမွေးထုတ်ပေးပေမဲ့လို့ကုသိုလ်စိတ်စဉ်ကကောင်းကျိုးတွေသူကမွေးထုတ်ပေးတော့တာပဲနော်ကောင်းကျိုးတွေရတော့တာပဲ
If one does not know the Satipatthana way of practice, or one knows it but one is not using it, or one knows it but one is not practicing in a meticulous, thorough, diligent manner, then the mental defilements, the kilesas, will arise. And a mind in which these mental defilements arise can be said to be in an akusala mind, a mind of unwholesomeness. And if observed, or if one does not observe, then then the mental defilements will enter. If one does observe the mental defilements, the mind will be freed of mental defilements. So, in the second case, the mental defilements cannot arise. Unwholesomeness cannot arise. When unwholesomeness, akusala, arises, then it produces unwholesome results. When wholesomeness arises in the stream of consciousness, then it produces wholesome results. So, the venerable, or there's a Burmese verse or short rhyme in this context, which has been translated, and kindly repeat this after me in the English language. So, the first time I'll just I'll recite it for you, and then please repeat after me. If observed, freed of defilements. If not observed, enter defilements. So it's very simple. Very simple, but but also very true. So please repeat after me. If observed, freed of defilements. If not observed, enter defilements. If observed, freed of defilements. If not observed, enter defilements. Now it's your turn. Doesn't quite sound like the Burmese, but
Three times diariga. Three times diariga. Twice up on my penny. Kanda data window fitted. Took at this attended diariga. Two Java to me in a kite of her. Missy Ichi that. Missy at a you. Kanda that you took at this attended diariga. Rigidare take up for a senior, Sinda, a data body. Dale, you do what is at the tiara. Music and amateur, anyway. Peter Mindida, Messi, take up for a single Mindida at the Lipia. Messi, Lema, say ne, I own it, so zida. Fasa covered, mean to it covered. Countess in a Sondiology, Concanzamu, so that a Sondiology, so Canzamu. Tina Kua at the Kugo Tinshavare. A video man near the Fadiva that Kanzar at the Volo Suvare. Doctor near Tomuluya, Concanzamu, so Canzamu. Now we're not covered. Pero mienti mi canzara da appunta na duka di satai dia. Yuk dukkha thissa thai deတရား 2 ပါးနဲ့ နာဒုက္ခသစ္စာထိုက်တဲ့တရား 3 ပါးပေါ့လေပေါင်းလိုက်လို့ရှိရင်တော့ယုတ်တရားနဲ့နာတရားတာပါပဲအဲ့ဒါကိုဒုက္ခသစ္စာတရားလို့ခေါ်ပါတယ်ဒီတော့မြင်စေကနာမှာထင်ရှားတဲ့ဒုက္ခသစ္စာတရားသိကြရင်မြင်စေမှာအခုလိုသတိပဋ္ဌာန်နည်းနဲ့လိုက်ပြီးတော့ရှုမှတ်ရပါတယ်မျက်စိမြင်ရယုတ်ကနှစ်ဖြာမြင်တွေ့ခံစားနာငါး 3 ဖြာမြင်စဉ်တွေ့ရဒုက္ခသစ္စာမြင်ဒုက္ခမှာတွေ့ရသိရတဲ့ထင်ရှားတဲ့ဒုက္ခသစ္စာထိုက်တဲ့တရားတွေမှတ်တော့ဘယ်လိုမှတ်မလဲမြင်တယ်ဟုမှတ်ရှုသိရပါတဲ့ရိုးရိုးလေးပဲမြင်တယ်လို့မှတ်ရှုရတာပါပဲဒါကမျက်စိပဲဒါကအစင်းပဲဒါကမြင်သိတာပဲဒါကမြင်တွေ့တာဒါကမြင်ခံစားတာပဲဆိုတော့ခွဲပြီးတော့မှတ်ဖို့မလိုပါဘူးလူတယောက်သိကျင်လို့ရှိရင်သူ့မျက်နှာကိုခြုံကြည့်လိုက်ပေါ့စိုက်ကြည့်နေလို့ရှိရင်သူကသူကွဲလာတာပါနှဖူးစီရောက်တာနှဖူးသိနာတန်စီရောက်တာနာတန်စီပါးစီရောက်တာပါးသိမျက်ခုံးစီရောက်တာမျက်ခုံးသိပေါ့မျက်လုံးစီရောက်တာမျက်လုံးသိပေါ့မေးစီရောက်တာမေးသိပေါ့အပေါင်းလိုက်စိုက်ကြည့်နေလို့ရှိရင်တခုစီစိတ်ရောက်သွားတယ်အဲ့ဒါကြီးကွဲသိလာတော့တာပါဒီသဘောပါပဲဒီတော့မြင်စက္ကနာမှာထင်ရှားတဲ့ဒုက္ခသစ္စာထိုက်တဲ့တရားတွေတစ်ခုချင်းခွဲစိတ်ပြီးတော့ရှုမှတ်ဖို့မလို့အပေါင်းလိုက်ပဲအဲ့ဒါကိုမြင်တယ်လို့ဒီလိုရှုမှတ်ရတာပါပဲအဲ့ဒီဆောင်ပုဒ်ကလေးတွေလည်းပဲအရှင်ဝိကန္နတာကချပြပါလိမ့်မယ်စိတ်ပါလက်ပါလိုက်ပြီးတော့ဆိုကြပါတစ်သက်လုံးဒါမှတ်ထားရမယ့်ဟာတွေပါပဲအရေးကြီးပါတယ်
Another thing that we have to pay attention to are the objects or what is occurring at the 6 sense doors. And what we have there are 3 elements, namely the striker element, the receptor element, and the ignition element. So let us take the seeing process. Involved in the seeing process is the eye, or the eye sensitivity, which then can be, which stands for, or which is materiality, rupa, and which shares the characteristics, or which is the truth, noble truth of suffering. And then we have the visible object, or the sight, which is the striker element, and this too is a form of materiality, and it is characterized by the noble truth of suffering. And when seeing conscious, when these two, the visible object and the eye, come in contact, then seeing consciousness arises, and this then is mentality. And here too, this it shares the characteristics, or it is governed by by suffering. And then the coming together of the sight, the eye sensitivity, and the seeing consciousness, this is known as seeing contact. The Pali term for this is phassa. And then based on this, a feeling may arise, either a pleasant feeling with regard to a desirable object, or an unpleasant feeling with regard to an undesirable object, and sometimes a neutral feeling. which is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And this pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling, this is known as Vedana. And this too arises with regard to the seeing process. Now, the seeing consciousness, the seeing contact, and the seeing feeling, these three form or make up the so-called ignition element. And the ignition element stands for, or is mentality, and here too we have the noble truth of suffering. And when we combine the first two, namely the sight, which is materiality, as well as the striker element, and then the receptor element in the form of the eye, and then the three parts of mentality, then these together make up mentality and materiality, nama and rupa, and they are the noble truth of suffering. And if one wants to know the truth of suffering, then one has to observe this during the seeing process as it is going on. And it is quite enough when to label simply as seeing, and it is not necessary to label as feeling or as contact or as seeing consciousness or so. So the illustration for this is when you want to look at when you want to see another person's face, then you look at the whole of it, at the entire face, and then in there you may detect certain details such as the nose and the mouth and the eyes and so on and so forth. And so here in this context of the seeing process, it is quite enough if one labels the whole as simply seeing. And sometimes one thing will stick out, and at one aspect will stick out. At another time, another aspect will stick out. Same, likewise, when you look at the face, sometimes the chin will stick out, sometimes the nose will stick out, and so on. So, again, for these two, we have some verse, some Dhamma verse, and I will recite it for you the first time, and then afterwards please repeat after me. And when you recite, please do so wholeheartedly. And the Venerable Sayadaw says that this verse here is meant for, or please remember it for your whole lifetime. So, truth of suffering appears in seeing, eye sensitivity and sight. Twofold is materiality. Seeing consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of seeing, label as seeing, observe, and know. So now please repeat after me. Truth of suffering appears in seeing, eye sensitivity and sight. Twofold is materiality. Seeing consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of seeing. Label as seeing, observe, and know. Truth of suffering appears in seeing. Eye sensitivity and sight. Twofold is materiality. Seeing consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of seeing. Label as seeing, observe, and know. One more time. Truth of suffering appears in seeing. Eye sensitivity and sight. Twofold is materiality. Seeing consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of seeing. Label as seeing, observe, and know. And now, please you try on your own. Eye sensitivity, twofold. Seeing consciousness, threefold. Truth of suffering in the experience of seeing. Label as seeing, so observe and know.
Very good. Oh,
okay. Okay. So, as you can imagine, there's more to come. And truth of suffering appears in hearing. Hearing, the ear sensitivity and sound. Twofold is materiality. Hearing, consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of hearing. Label as hearing, observe, and know. So now please repeat. Truth of suffering appears in hearing. Ear sensitivity and sound is materiality. Hearing, consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of hearing. Label as hearing, observe, and know. Truth of suffering appears in smelling. No sense. Yeah, let me read it out from the first ones. So Sayadaw says, please you try on your own. So please, truth of suffering appears in hearing. No sensitivity and smell. Twofold is materiality. Smelling, consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of smelling. Label as smelling, observe, and know.
Very active and bright.
Truth of suffering appears in tasting. So once again, truth of suffering appears in tasting. And tongue sensitivity and flavor. Twofold is materiality. And then tasting consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering in the experience of tasting. label as tasting, observe, and know. Truth of suffering appears in touching, body sensitivity, and tactile impression. Or touch, let's go for touch, that's easier. So, the body sensitivity and touch. Twofold is materiality, touching consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality, truth of suffering in the experience of touching, label as touching, observe, and know. And now the last one, which is slightly different. Let me recite once alone. Mind and mind object, twofold is thinking, thinking consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality, truth of suffering in the experience of thinking, label is thinking, observe, and know. So please repeat, or let's do together. Mind and mind object, twofold is thinking, thinking consciousness, contact, feeling. Threefold is mentality, truth of suffering in the experience of thinking, label as thinking, observe, and know. So now the Venerable wants all of you to recite the whole thing from the very beginning to the very end.
So.
Truth of suffering appears in seeing, eye sensitivity and sight. Consciousness. Truth of suffering, experience of seeing, label as seeing, observe and know. Truth of suffering, experience of hearing, ear sensitivity and sound. Twofold is materiality, hearing consciousness, contact and feeling. Threefold is mentality, truth of suffering, experience of hearing, label as hearing, observe and know. Truth of suffering, experience of sound. Yeah, no sensitivity. No sensitivity and sound. Twofold is materiality. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering, experience of smelling. Label as smelling, observe and know. Truth of suffering, experience of tasting. Flavor. Tasting consciousness, contact feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth. Tasting. As tasting, observe and know. Truth of suffering appears in touching, body sensitivity and touch. Twofold is materiality, touching consciousness. Threefold is mentality, truth of suffering, experience of touching, label as touching, observe and know. Truth of suffering and experience of thinking. No. Mind and mind object, twofold is thinking. mind and mind object. Twofold is thinking. Thinking consciousness, contact feeling. Threefold is mentality. Truth of suffering, the experience of thinking. Label as thinking, observe and know.
Khana daita punda khore yungnan diyari dugati satire diyari trup se lai bido shu yin bana dugati sa ti lai da ne duyati sa khore taya tamamu tanha le phit khwa mya ro pe phu kaisa le lu pi si twaတယ်မနေ့ကပြောခဲ့တဲ့အတိုင်းကိုသုံးပါးလည်းပဲဖြစ်ခွင့်မရဘဲနဲ့ချုပ်သွားတယ်ကိလေသာဝတ္တကမ္မဝတ္တဥပက္ခဝတ္တနောက်ဒီထဲမှာတက်ခွဲကြည့်တဲ့အခါကျတော့ဒီသီလမဲ့ခင်သမာဓိမဲ့ခင်ပညာမဲ့ခင်ပေါ့လေဘာဝနာစိတ်အစုထဲမှာတက်ခွဲကြည့်လိုက်လို့ရှိရင်ဖြစ်ပေါ်စီတိုက်တဲ့မေဃတိစာတွေလည်းပဲပါသွားတယ်အဲ့ဒါလည်းပွားပြီးတော့ဖြစ်သွားတယ်တရားဒုက္ခသစ္စာတရားကိုဘုလိုတိပ္ပာနီးနဲ့ရှုလို့သိလိုက်တာနဲ့ပဲဒုရသစ္စာပယ်မှုကိစ္စအလိုလိုပြီးစီတယ်ဒီလိုသစ္စာမျက်မှောက်ဆိုင်မှုကိစ္စအလိုလိုပြီးစီပြီးတော့ပြီးတော့မေဃသစ္စာကိုလည်းပဲပွားမှုအလိုလိုကိစ္စပြီးစီသွားတယ်ဖိုးအတပလို့ပေါ့လေတစ်ချက်ခုတ်လေးချက်ပြဆိုတာဒါပေါ့တိပဲစိုက်ပွားလေးပါးချက်ပြိုင်နဲ့မိကိစ္စကြီးဆိုတာပေါ့လေဓမ္မဒါကြောင့်ဒုက္ခမြင်ကကိုယ်တွေကဒုက္ခသစ္စာထဲတဲ့တရားတွေကိုအခုလိုသိပ္ပံနည်းနဲ့ရှုလို့အတိညာနဲ့မြင်သွားတဲ့ကရှင်းရှင်းမြင်သွားတဲ့ကမြင်လိုက်တာနဲ့ပဲကျွန်းသစ္စာတဲ့ဉာဏ်နဲ့သစ္စာ၃ပါးပယ်မှုစိုက်မှုပွားမှုကိစ္စအလိုလိုပြီးစီးသည်တဲ့အဲ့ဒါလေးလည်းချပေးလိုက်ချပြီးတော့တရားသိကြဆိုပါပြီးတော့နောက်ဝိဒနာဉာဏ်ပြည့်စုံသွားတဲ့ခါကျတော့ချုပ်ရင်းတဲ့နိဗ္ဗာန်ကိုမြင်သွားမယ်အဲ့တော့နိဗ္ဗာန်မြင်ကကျွင်းသစ္စာမှန်စွာသိမှုပြည့်ဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒီခါမှာတရားကိုအနေနဲ့ပေါ့လေကိစ္စပြီးသွားမယ်
So one sees or one understands the noble truth of suffering with regard to the six sense doors and the three elements there, namely the striker element, the receptor element, and the ignition element. And if one observes the arising objects, then one will know this truth of suffering, and as a result of this, craving, attachment, and tanha can no longer arise. And with this also clinging can no longer arise. And this then means that the truth of the origin of suffering is abandoned, and with the abandoning of the round of mental defilements, kilesa vata, one then also abandons the other the other rounds, namely the one round of actions and results. And rather than saying abandoning, there's also the cutting off of these rounds. Now, when one observes the presently arising objects, then in this the factors of the Eightfold Noble Path are included, and with this the truth of the noble truth of the path gets developed. And when knowing the truth of suffering, automatically and simultaneously, the abandoning of the origin of suffering, namely craving, is accomplished. Simultaneously, the truth of the cessation of suffering, namely nirodha satya, is accomplished, and simultaneously also is the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, namely magga satya, accomplished. So 4 things with the knowing of or full understanding of the truth of suffering, one accomplishes 4 things at a time. So 4 at a blow. When seeing the truth of suffering, then the remaining 3 truths will be automatically and simultaneously accomplished. And for this too, we have another verse, namely, seeing suffering accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. So please repeat this after me. Seeing suffering accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. Once again, seeing suffering accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. Once again, seeing suffering accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. And when one then continues with one's Vipassana meditation practice and gradually progresses through the remaining insight knowledges, and these come to maturity, then eventually Nibbana will be realized by oneself, and with this the function of knowing, of fully understanding, is automatically fulfilled. And for this aspect we have yet another, and this is going to be the last rhyme for today, namely, seeing Nibbana accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. So please, seeing Nibbana accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. Seeing Nibbana accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. Seeing Nibbana accomplished is correct knowledge of other truths. And this is it for today. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.